Okay, today we're going to talk about Spain's conquest of the Andean civilizations, largely the Incan Empire, and going a little bit further south and further east into present day Chile, parts of Argentina, and Venezuela and Colombia. But the biggest empire, native empire in South America, is by far the Incan Empire by the time the Spanish show up to the area in the early 1500s. And much like what we talked about before with the Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica, a lot of this is going to be led by uh, extraordinarily greedy and brutal Spanish conquistadors. So the most famous among this group is named Francisco Pizarro. So Pizarro was a child of a Spanish landowner who did not inherit much land himself. So, as a kind of younger guy, he went to Hispaniola and lived in the original Spanish colony on the first island. So, Pizarro started off as one of the early colonists in Hispaniola and rose through the government ranks and went with one of the early attempts at colonizing the South American mainland, which actually started off in present day Panama. So, this kind of offshoot of land sticking up from northwestern South America. So the Spanish first tried to colonize Panama, uh, somewhat successful for the first decade or so, but Pizarro was one of the main people involved in that. He was given an encomendera, so he was a landowner in the Panama colony. He had a lot of native workers, and he was getting rich kind of slowly year by year through his landowning and his business in Panama. He was still involved in the colonial government at Panama when the government started planning more excursions, more expeditions to travel further south from Panama into the mainland, largely because a lot of the expedition leaders were hearing rumors of an empire somewhere down there that was laden with gold and had gold and silver and riches just kind of laying around everywhere. So again, we see the emergence of this El Dorado legend amongst a lot of the Spanish explorers and adventurers. So a couple of expeditions were attempted to go further south. Um, they were both destroyed by native attack. So they were both two total abject failures uh, by the kind of 1520s. And Pizarro, though, is not daunted by that. He volunteers and is given command of a third voyage that would go further south again. So he packed up a bunch of government resources and soldiers and whatnot and traveled, sailed down to what we now recognize as the city of Tumbes, which is one of the northernmost outposts of the Incan Empire as it existed at that point. So Pizarro reaches Tumbes, he kind of unloads and kind of settles the area more or less, and he's in the area gathering intelligence, gathering rumors, and any information he can possibly find on any legends of any kind of large native empires in the area, especially any that might have a lot of gold with them. And the rumors that he hears from other native groups and interpreters largely confirms the legend of El Dorado, saying that there's this massive gold-laden kingdom further to the south. And so this piques Pizarro's interest greatly, and he starts planning largely an invasion, Spanish invasion from Tumbes to move further south. But the governor at Panama was unwilling to fund another excursion. So Pizarro first returned to Panama and had discussions with that governor and was unable to convince the governor to support what Pizarro wanted to do. So Pizarro kind of audaciously, at that point, he gets on a boat with a few of his people and they sail all the way back to Spain. And Pizarro meets with the head Spanish government and is able to convince the council that is running these colonies to appoint him to be the new governor of the colony around Panama. And so Pizarro is given this greater government position to where he's going to be the head decision maker for the area. And so he gives noble titles to the followers that are kind of agreeing with him that he wants to still launch this expedition further south to find the golden laden kingdom that is, legendarily reported on from the people he had talked to. So he gives noble titles to his few followers that are willing to assist him in trying this, and he recruits a whole bunch of Spanish soldiers in Spain itself. And once he has all these resources together, he and his squadron set sail from Spain and come all the way back to Panama by 1530. And from Panama, he kind of announces his new authority, makes the decision to fund a new expedition, and they go all the way back down to Tumbes again. By the time they reach Tumbes in 1530, they start hearing rumors and evidence from native groups in the area that this southern empire, this native empire, is involved in a civil war between several different claimants to the throne. So this really piques Pizarro's interest because, like Cortez and other conquistadors before him, he figures that the best way to attack and conquer a gigantic native empire is to take advantage over their own internal political fighting or social controversies and splits, or whatever you can possibly find to divide the enemy in order to conquer them and control them for the far-term future. So Pizarro starts setting all this up. He sets up a city at Tumbes to kind of guard his retreat in case his expedition has to retreat in case they get attacked with overwhelming numbers. And so he's looking to kind of guard his retreat as best possible. And then he starts to plan to move his armies further south to poke around and look for this giant kingdom. The Incan leadership had been aware that the Spanish were kind of making these approaches, and the thing that really seems to have started the Incan Civil War was actually a disease epidemic that most historians believe came from the Spanish people themselves coming to the area. So there is this massive disease epidemic that starts spreading around the northern Incan territory in the late 1520s, and even killed the Incan emperor and the heir to the throne. So that is what destabilized the Incan government and opened the door to this civil war, as some of the younger brothers of the king kind of fought each other for power and raised armies and went after each other to claim the throne for themselves. So the two major factions in this Incan civil war are first, one of the brothers is named Huascar, and he has his political power base is in the city of Cusco, which is further south, the normal Incan imperial capital city. And there is another brother named Atahualpa, who mostly has his power base further up in the north, closer to Tumbes, where Pizarro and the Spanish are kind of moving out from and starting to move further south. So this civil war had been going since the late 1520s as the disease epidemic spread. And there was a kind of loose truce in the warfare between Atahualpa and Huascar that held for about 2 years or so. But it largely appears that Atahualpa only agreed to the truce because he didn't think that he could win an outright civil war. So he agrees to the truce in order to build up his own political contacts within the empire and raise his own army and look for a good opportunity to rebel. And he eventually does rebel. He ends the truce and starts the civil war again. And now that he has more experienced generals and soldiers on his side, Atahualpa's forces actually win the civil war and start kind of imprisoning and executing Huascar and his generals and leaders. So Atahualpa and his entourage have just won the civil war when Pizarro is starting to move south, and Atahualpa's entourage is moving south, also going to Cusco to officially claim the Incan throne. So Atahualpa and Pizarro had actually heard of each other because they're in such kind of close proximity to each other, and these are big political events that all of the natives living in the northern Incan Empire know about. It's very famous and kind of world-changing stuff to them. So Atahualpa knew that the Spanish were kind of in the area, in the region. So Atahualpa sent some advisors and spies basically to get close to the Spanish and observe them and try to figure out, is this Spanish incursion something that Atahualpa and the Incan government should really worry about and think about attacking or trying to defeat, or taking some kind of action. The advisors seem to have come back to Atahualpa and told him that the Spanish force is really not much to worry about. It's not that many soldiers, and the Incan army could probably defeat it with really just a few hundred Incan soldiers. So that really reassured Atahualpa, and he continued on his kind of journey south in 1532 to claim the throne at Cusco. Pizarro, though, through his own contacts and spies and the natives he bribed for information, appears to have gotten much more accurate information. So Pizarro is kind of much more aware of Atahualpa's strengths and how the Incan government functions and what's been going on within the Incan government, the divisions and whatnot. So Pizarro and Atahualpa are actually, they're not just kind of spying on each other and trying to kind of feel each other out and whatnot, detect each other's strengths and weaknesses. They're also in direct communication with each other through messengers. So Pizarro invites Atahualpa to meet to form some kind of truce, or there's pretty vague language, but Pizarro asked Atahualpa to an official meeting at a town called Cajamarca, which is really pretty much between Tumbes and the capital city at Cusco, which is further south. And Atahualpa actually agrees to meet Pizarro because his advisors tell him that the Spanish force is nothing really to worry about. So Atahualpa agrees to meet Pizarro and the Spanish at Cajamarca on November 15th, 1532. So Atahualpa is traveling with his large entourage of bodyguards and servants, and he even has something like 40,000 soldiers with him as he's moving further south to go to Cusco to claim the throne. So Atahualpa feels very safe in meeting the Spanish. Atahualpa, as he approaches Cajamarca, he gives orders to his 40,000 soldiers and their leaders to stay outside of the town and just kind of observe what happens and try to intervene if something goes wrong and some kind of fighting breaks out. So Atahualpa does not bring his mass army into the town itself. He really only takes about 5,000 or so bodyguards and largely just royal servants, people that are not experienced in direct fighting, direct combat. So they're kind of imperial advisors and politicians and stuff like that. So he doesn't have a very big military force really to protect him in case something does go wrong in the town of Cajamarca itself. So we now know that Pizarro from the very outset intended to try to capture Atahualpa in order to take over the entire Incan Empire. So Pizarro arrived, and his forces, the Spanish, arrived to Cajamarca first. And they hid cannon in different parts of the city, strategic locations, so that at a moment's notice they can all fire their cannon and annihilate any Incan soldiers or resistance that come into the town. But again, Atahualpa has most of his army stay outside the town, so the cannon are going to be extremely useful, and Pizarro also hid soldiers throughout the town. So when Atahualpa and his entourage arrive at the town and they enter, the town looks mostly fairly empty, and Pizarro kind of appears with a few of his advisors, but it doesn't appear like he has an army with him. So Atahualpa feels, again, overconfident and very safe. So as Atahualpa and his entourage enter the town, Pizarro basically gives the signal for the cannon to fire on the entourage, and they kill a large amount of the bodyguard, and then the Spanish soldiers come out to fight, and they basically massacre most of Atahualpa's entourage. A few of them escape the town and get out and seek refuge with the Incan army that's sitting outside. But they do capture Atahualpa inside the city, and this is a famous image of the capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca. A painting made much later. So the giant Incan army, watched all this unfold and basically panicked. They probably could have intervened and wiped out the Spanish with 40,000 troops on their side, but they basically panicked and did nothing. So the amount of kind of terror that the Spanish inflicted on the entourage in the town terrorized the army also sitting outside the town and intimidated the army leaders so much that they refused to intervene. And this is kind of largely symbolic of a lot of other big problems that the Incan government will immediately have after Cajamarca, and it's really the problem of indecision. The Incan government doesn't know how to respond to this, and the Incan government is kind of paralyzed and fractures again. So the official leaders of the government, his official advisors that are now in the kind of decision-making position, they had a big decision to make. Do they want to launch a major attack against all the Spanish and just wipe them out and get rid of the Spanish problem completely? They didn't seem to want to do that because historians believe that the Incan leadership, Atahualpa's political party basically, were very afraid that such a counterattack would get Atahualpa killed either in the fighting itself or that the Spanish would quickly execute Atahualpa as kind of revenge for being attacked in the first place. So Atahualpa is not just a prisoner, he's basically a hostage. There's also, though, the other faction that still exists, Huascar's faction. And Huascar and his advisors, they're basically very hopeful that the Spanish are there to help Huascar defeat Atahualpa's party and faction, and to help Huascar get to the Incan throne, and that maybe the Spanish would be able to make some kind of deal with Huascar, to take some money or something and leave the Incan Empire and never come back. So Huascar and his advisors are really hopeful that they'll be able to use the Spanish to win the Incan Civil War and stay on the throne, and basically figure that they'll deal with the Spanish at some point after that. Atahualpa himself, personally, the sitting emperor, seemed to believe that the Spanish weren't really interested in conquering and controlling the Incan Empire, that they just mostly wanted money. So Atahualpa kind of negotiated as a prisoner with Pizarro and the other Spanish leaders, and basically ransomed himself to the Spanish. Pizarro demanded in the eventual deal that Atahualpa will be forced to agree to fill one large room from floor to ceiling with gold, and two more kind of comparatively sized rooms, large rooms, from floor to ceiling with silver. And the eventual deal is that if Atahualpa can accomplish this, that they will set him free at another place, another city, once these rooms are filled with the treasure. So Atahualpa said, okay, that's fine with me. So he sent messages to his government to have the gold and silver brought from really all over the Incan Empire to Cajamarca, where he's being held prisoner, and fill the rooms with it. And this actually occurs. So eventually, these rooms are filled, and Pizarro and the Spanish have to figure out how they're going to kind of split up the loot amongst themselves. And Pizarro's eventual decision as leader of the expedition, the kind of government figurehead, the Spanish leader, is to basically assign a certain amount of gold and silver in weight, in pounds, to each member of the Spanish expedition according to their rank in the army. So Pizarro, as the leader of the thing, he personally took 640 pounds of gold and 1,260 pounds of silver for his own personal cut of the treasure. And that would have immediately made him one of the richest Iberians of his lifetime. So this is a windfall, a massive amount of money that the Spanish are going to basically steal, take out of the Incan Empire. The rest of the loot was distributed to Pizarro soldiers, again by their rank, and even the lowest infantrymen, even the lowest level soldier, individually got 45 pounds of gold each and 90 pounds of silver. So this is a massive amount of wealth that Atahualpa has brought as ransom. So at this point, you know, Atahualpa is basically bargaining for his life. He's ransomed himself. Most historians, though, think that a large-scale attack by the Incan army, which would have been tens of thousands of troops, probably could have destroyed the Spanish invaders and killed all the Spanish and kind of solved at least that short-term problem. But Atahualpa, for himself, was worried that the Spanish intended to form an alliance with Huascar and restart the Civil War, and that Huascar would win the Civil War with the Spanish on his side. So Atahualpa, even while he's imprisoned, waiting for the ransom to be paid, orders Huascar to be executed. And so he basically had his own brother murdered. So Huascar is out of the picture from that point forward. Might be kind of shocking to a lot of people, but you have to remember this is a kind of family civil war where family members have been killing each other for a while. So it's not the first close family member that Atahualpa had executed during the Civil War. So it's kind of a normal strategy for these kind of royal infighting situations. And in order to try to break down, not just have Huascar killed, but to break down his whole kind of political support and economic support amongst his faction, Atahualpa ordered the gold and silver that would be paid to the Spanish in ransom to free him to be taken from temples in the areas that generally supported Huascar in the Civil War, probably because he knew that the Spanish would then go looking for those temples and try to get even more loot out of them and might even destroy them. So Atahualpa is making decisions even while he's imprisoned to ransom himself, to save himself, but he's also making decisions as if he is still fighting a civil war against his internal political opponents within the Incan Empire. So Huascar is killed. Atahualpa is still prisoner even after he pays the ransom because of the kind of next section we're going to get into. While this ransom is being paid and Pizarro and his army is dividing the loot, new Spanish kind of reinforcements show up to the area, and they meet with Pizarro, and they are led by a guy named Diego de Almagro. So this is about 150 new Spanish soldiers that are showing up to the area, and they see the ransom, and they think, all right, we're getting a portion of this too. And Pizarro gave them a very small portion compared to what he kind of doled out to the soldiers that had been with him during this whole expedition. So Almagro's men were very angry at this, and they wanted more, and they started to demand even a new level of ransom in order to free Atahualpa. So this starts getting very kind of confusing and scary for Atahualpa, because now he's going to have to pay even more possibly. So Almagro and his men, they want a new ransom because they want money for themselves, and they don't want the new ransom to be confused with the first ransom. So they really kind of met with Pizarro and pushed him to try to convince him to execute Atahualpa so that the kind of different ransoms would not be kind of merged together on one giant pile of gold and silver. And so Pizarro, under this political pressure, did order Atahualpa to be executed in 1533 through a kind of really ugly, brutal method called garroting, which is basically where they sit the victim down in a chair and they put a steel collar around their neck, and they have a winch behind it where they just tighten it until the victim either strangles to death, dies of suffocation, or until the metal winch breaks their spinal cord. So it's a pretty horrible way to die. But Pizarro did that to appease the Almagro faction of the now enlarged Spanish army in the area. And now that Atahualpa is killed, the Incan throne has to go to somebody if the Incan government's going to still exist. And Pizarro wanted it to still exist. He wanted to set up basically a puppet government under his own control. So Pizarro wants to choose who the next Incan emperor is going to be. And he chooses a member of the royal family that was close to Atahualpa that Pizarro felt that he would be able to control personally. The problem is that that puppet emperor appears to have gotten the plague or gotten the disease, caught the disease, and died en route while traveling to Cusco to be crowned in the first place. So even that guy didn't even last very long. And now Pizarro has to find somebody else. So Pizarro picks out a brother of that guy who had gotten sick and died en route, and chose that guy to be the next Incan emperor. But while all this is going on, Atahualpa's faction was able to raise an army and try to attack the entourage that's taking this new would-be emperor of the Incan Empire. Atahualpa's army attacked that entourage in order to try to take power for themselves and claim the throne and possibly start a war against Pizarro and the Spanish. So Pizarro, desperately looking for some kind of way to win the civil war amongst the Inca, basically goes to Huáscar's old advisors and tries to get them together to build up a faction to fight off Atahualpa's old army. So in effect, the Incan Civil War is continuing just with this major Spanish kind of intervention. So eventually Huáscar's army does defeat Atahualpa's army, and that final defeat of the kind of major Incan army is what really opened the capital city Cusco for the Spanish to enter the city and formally basically conquer the empire and start to rule it themselves. Pizarro, though, never feels all that comfortable or safe in Cusco. So Pizarro wants to create a different capital city, so he founds a city that he calls Lima, further to the west and closer to the right on the coastline. And he calls it Lima, which is kind of bastardization of the native word for epiphany. So Pizarro kind of gave it a half Spanish, half Incan name. And he allows his chosen successor, the guy he thinks he's going to be able to control as a puppet, to run a kind of puppet Incan government from Cusco. And that new emperor becomes known as Manco Inca. The problem for Pizarro, though, is that Manco Inca is mostly interested in not just being a puppet, being under Spanish control, but he is secretly trying to figure out how to reunite all of the Incan people, all the kind of divergent different groups and different factions within the government. He's working to unite them all into one large group, one unified movement to attack the Spanish and kick them, either kill them off or completely kick them out of the Incan territories. So Manco Inca eventually does figure out how to bring a bunch of the factions together, because all the factions hated the Spanish by this point. And Manco Inca built up an army of about 50,000 soldiers and laid siege to Cusco and used part of that army to attack other Spanish military contingents around the area. So this is now not so much a civil war among the Inca, but it's a kind of rebellion of the Inca to try to defeat the Spanish and destroy their power. And Manco Inca's armies are mostly successful. They laid siege to Cusco. Um, they forced the Spanish to fight on battlefields that were advantageous for the Inca, mostly because they tried to force the Spanish to fight on kind of mountainside type areas that would neutralize the Spanish ability to use their horses as cavalry, because the horses can't really charge up and down those steep kind of hillsides or mountainsides. So the Incan were very smart in the battlefields they chose, and they won most of the battles, and they nearly completely obliterated the Spanish armies that they fought with. The big problem, though, is that the Incan army cannot recapture or reconquer Cusco from the Spanish. So the Spanish are able to hole up in the city and hide behind the buildings and whatnot. And they're able to hold the city with only about 200 Spanish soldiers in total against thousands and thousands of Incan soldiers. So the Spanish inside Cusco absolutely refused to surrender. And this goes on for quite a while. And Pizarro was back at Lima, so he is able to raise another Spanish army. And then eventually he attacks the Incan army from behind while they're laying siege to Cusco. Pizarro comes up behind them and attacks them and defeats them to relieve the siege of Cusco so that the Spanish can come out of Cusco. And that at that point, Manco Inca realizes that the game is up, and that's going to be about it for that rebellion. So Manco Inca basically then gave up the fight and announced to his followers that they should move into the interior away from the coastline. And they'll try to continue the Incan Empire, the Incan Kingdom, pretty far away from the Spanish-held territory. And Manco Inca's great dream is to kind of rebuild Incan power out there and eventually come back and reclaim the empire from the Spanish. But he'll never be able to really accomplish that, and he'll die in 1544, and his throne will kind of go to his descendants. And they will remain independent until the Spanish finally have enough power to in the area to launch attacks against the interior and finally destroy that very last remnant of the Incan Empire in the 1570s. So that remnant of the Incan Empire exists for about 35 years or so, and it's always a kind of ongoing implicit threat to Spanish stability along the coastline. The next big problem for the Spanish is really their own internal greed and infighting. So the Manco-Incan kind of rebellion is ended, and the Spanish win that war in 1537, and very quickly after that they start arguing amongst each other over which faction is going to govern which cities and how much wealth is going to go to which side and whatnot. So the Spanish occupation of the Incan Empire basically devolves down into two major factions, one led by Pizarro, the other led by Almagro. And their infighting, their constant bickering, leads to a civil war between them, between the two factions in 1538. That Pizarro's faction eventually wins, or fairly quickly wins within the year, and has Diego de Almagro executed in 1538, and executes several of his highest advisors and leaders. So Pizarro seems, and his faction seem like they're completely in control of the former Incan Empire and the whole coastline for the long term. But the survivors of Almagro's faction, especially the kind of next generation, the younger generation, are extremely angry that Pizarro took that kind of retribution against Almagro and the leadership. And they start a kind of coup against Pizarro's government in 1541 that kills Pizarro at that point. So now Pizarro is going to be out of the picture also, and the Almagro faction will run the colony for a few months at least. And all this infighting, it was very violent, and it was very kind of angry and greedy and all kinds of ugliness. So now that Pizarro and Almagro are both out of the picture, all this infighting has really outraged the Spanish king all the way back home in Spain. He hears about this and really just kind of loses it. And he's so angry at the chaos that he picks out one of his own guys in Spain itself and sends this guy to be a new governor over the area to basically defeat both factions and reestablish direct Spanish government control over the area. So there's a Spanish-led counter coup in 1542 when that squadron shows up to the area and defeats both the Almagro faction and the Pizarro faction and reestablish government in 1542, reestablish some amount of stability. And the Spanish king was so angry at this stuff that by the end of that year, he implements a major series of reforms to try to end the sources of the chaos for the long term. And these become known as the New Laws of November 1542. So these, in part, are directed at destroying the sources of the chaos in the areas that the Spanish have conquered in Western South America. The biggest one is that it ends the ability of the encomiendas to be inherited from generation to generation. And remember, these are the kind of big land-based power systems. So the Spanish king says that the conquerors, the conquistadors who have the land now, who are the official landowners out there in Western South America, the old Incan Empire, that they will be able to keep the land for their lifetime, but once they die, the land will revert back to the Spanish government, and the Spanish government will be able to decide what to do with that land. So that's a big, shocking change, and it really angers, obviously, the younger generation who feel that they're being dispossessed of, their rightful inheritance and all that. It also, the new laws in part specifically take native workers from the landowners of anyone who was involved in any of the factions during these civil wars between Pizarro and Almagro and their kind of supporters. So it directly attacks not just their ability to inherit land, but also takes the workforce away from them. So it explicitly takes the workforce away from them in order to destroy their wealth and basically teach them a lesson. So these are just part of the new laws, and we'll talk more about the new laws after the first test, as we talked about the kind of economic development of the colonies, after the major conquests were complete. But these are the parts of the new laws of 1542 that are directly related to the infighting that we saw between the Spanish conquistador factions. The problem, though, for the long term is that these new laws anger the factions so much that one faction, the Pizarro faction, gets back together and they start a rebellion because they hated the new laws so much, and they hated the new Spanish governor for trying to enforce the laws. So a new faction kind of coalesces around Gonzalo Pizarro, the kind of eldest inheriting son of the Pizarro name and wealth and whatnot. And they revolt against that governor after a few years in 1546. And their basic demand is to refuse to enforce the new laws. So not only do they rebel against the governor, they actually kill the governor in the fighting, and Gonzalo takes over the government. A bunch of his faction want to declare formal independence from Spain and declare themselves to be really a new kingdom, a new government completely. But Gonzalo did not want to do that because he feared what the Spanish government might kind of do to them as a result. So Gonzalo refused to declare independence, and instead mostly just used a type of reign of terror against anyone he suspected of being disloyal to him and his kind of governorship. So he jailed and executed and exiled and did all kinds of horrible things to anyone that he even slightly suspected of conspiring against him. So that tends to do bad things to government and government leaders, because now everyone suspects each other and everybody's afraid all the time. So it's like mass paranoia within the government. So the government doesn't really make very good decisions for the long term. And once the word gets back to Spain that Gonzalo Pizarro and this faction have done this, the Spanish king just really flips out and orders a new major kind of contingent of a royalist military presence, a royalist army, to go into this place and to destroy this rebellion and reassert direct government authority again. So once that formal official Spanish army under the king's name arrives in the area, it basically destroys the rebellion pretty much immediately, and will run on. The new government will basically take over in 1549. Gonzalo Pizarro's supporters basically wither away and disappear immediately when the major Spanish army shows up. And the new appointed leader of the colony is named Pedro de la Gasca, and he is very good at restoring order in the Spanish king's name. And that leads to some pretty specific results. The biggest one is that Gonzalo Pizarro is jailed and put on trial and executed by the end of 1549. So he is beheaded publicly as a lesson that you do not rebel against the king's authority. So Pedro de la Gasca will reassert kind of stability and better governance, and he'll be in office through the 1550s. There's a few kind of conspiracies and kind of rumors of challenges to de la Gasca's government through the 1550s, but there's no major kind of civil war, no major kind of battles or infight or anything like that. There's just kind of these rumors and small conspiracies and whatnot that de la Gasca is very good at dealing with. So that's the real return of Spanish authority in the area for the long term. Moving on to kind of the next area in all this is that further south from where all this was happening, further south from Lima and Cusco, there's some major discoveries of silver in the ground at a place called Potosi in 1545. And the Spanish invest very heavily in kind of exploring around that area to find the extent of the silver that's in the mountains and in the ground and whatnot. And they're going to start building silver mines all over the place to extract that silver for Spain's enrichment, to make money out of and whatnot. So there's so much silver that's going to be extracted that the Spanish will take more wealth out of Potosi in the next couple decades just through mining, far more than Hernán Cortés had captured when he conquered the entire Aztec Empire a couple decades before. So the silver mines at Potosi are extremely productive. And of course, that just further inspires future generations of explorers to keep poking around further and further south, because they're going to keep looking for silver mines or gold mines. And there's always these rumors of El Dorado is still out there somewhere. There's another El Dorado even beyond the Incan Empire. So Spanish explorers and adventurers and conquistadors will continue kind of poking around further and further south and east, looking for the next big gold strike, but they never really find anything else, especially in South America. The Incan Empire was really it for gold in the whole continent. So that moves us into the next section, which is really the next wave of Spanish explorations and conquest beyond the Incan Empire. So the Spanish start moving south from the Incan Empire into modern-day Chile. In 1541, they found a capital city there that they call Santiago. And they used that as their kind of base colony where they're going to kind of build out from that city first and try to colonize the rest of the western coastline. Most native groups south of the Incan Empire going down towards Santiago were decentralized. They were not urban. They were largely hunter-gatherer societies. They still tried to resist the Spanish incursion and every once in a while attack Santiago or the Spanish kind of groups wherever they are. In one instance, they nearly destroyed Santiago. So even though these are hunter-gatherer societies, there's enough of them to really pose a major threat to the Spanish colonization effort. So this again convinces the Spanish that far south to use mass terrorism against natives in order to subdue them and convince them that it's not worth rebelling over, that they should just give up for their own good. The Spanish in the south, especially around Santiago, became famous for not just capturing native rebellious leaders, but beheading them publicly, and then taking the beheaded body and throwing it at the army of the natives that seemed like they're still willing to fight, in order to show them how horrific and brutal the Spanish would be against anyone that they had to fight and had to conquer. There's also some gold discoveries, gold mines largely, further south in 1552 that start to bring more and more Spanish colonists further and further south. The Spanish colonists also really enjoyed the very fertile soil around what is today Chile, and they really enjoyed the climate because it reminded them very closely of their Iberian homeland. So they felt that they had found like a Spain kind of terrain and climate in the southwestern corner of South America, really, along the coastline. So they set up agricultural economies. They set up their silver and gold mines to extract the wealth as much as they could. And again, this always relies on native labor sources that they kind of informally enslaved, and sometimes even formally enslaved outright in name. So terrorism and enslavement against the natives to force them to work on the Spanish lands and the Spanish farms or in the Spanish mines. The natives obviously hated this, and after a certain amount of time they start trying to figure out how to rebel. And the big native leader of these rebellions will become known as Lautaro, and he has a pretty interesting personal history. He is a leader of the Mapuche tribe. He had been captured at a very young age, around 10 or 11, so the story says, and enslaved as a servant to a Spanish landowner. And that Spanish landowner was involved in the conquest. He was a military leader. So that Spanish general basically would bring Lautaro along with him as a servant, going along in the wars against the natives of the area. So as Lautaro became a teenager and grows up and watching all this over about 10 years or so, he learns how the Spanish weapons operate, what their destructive capacity is. He learns the Spanish battle and attack tactics and strategies. So he learns how the Spanish do this as an insider, really. And then he escaped his captors and ran off to his own people, the Mapuche tribe, and rises as a leader in that tribe very quickly because he says he knows the secret of how to defeat the Spanish invaders. And as the leader of the group, he raised an army pretty quickly, thought up battlefield tactics to defeat the Spanish military, and especially to neutralize the Spanish advantages, cavalry, Spanish soldiers on horses, and the use of Spanish firearms. And Lautaro will lead this army with these tactics in a giant rebellion against the Spanish authority, Spanish control over the area. And his basic tactics were to divide his army into several different pieces, different divisions, to attack the Spanish on several sides at the same time in order to sow a certain amount of chaos in the Spanish soldiers. And Lautaro would also specifically choose battlegrounds that had very soft ground, very muddy ground often, because that would neutralize the Spanish horses who could not attack very reliably or very quickly in this very muddy, kind of soft ground. So Lautaro's armies win several battles and even killed the founding leaders of Santiago in one battle. So it appears that Lautaro's strategies are working over these few years in the mid 1550s where this rebellion is happening. But unfortunately, Lautaro himself was killed in one of these battles, and his army became infected with apparently European diseases that caused an epidemic in their tribe that really wiped out a lot of their soldiers and gave the Spanish a new opportunity to counterattack right when a new Spanish army has moved south from Lima to help retake Santiago and the surrounding area. So by 1557, Lautaro is dead and his rebellion is defeated. And very similarly, they kind of abandon the ground that the Spanish want, the lands that the Spanish want, and they go off further into the interior. And they'll remain, the Mapuche will remain fully independent right up to the point where the Spanish Empire starts to disintegrate in the early 1800s. So that's the story of how the kind of colony around what is modern day Chile was first kind of founded and created and defended against native rebellion. From that colony, some Portuguese explorers are moving around the Brazilian coastline, which we'll talk much more about tomorrow, next lecture. But Brazil is kind of this kind of blank spot in the South American map on this map, and it's outlined in green. So the Portuguese have been kind of poking and prodding around the what is today the Brazilian coastline ever since the 1520s, and that convinced the Spanish to start also exploring as much of the kind of southern eastern coastline as they possibly can in order to keep the Portuguese explorers out and to claim as much land for Spain as they possibly can by the 1530s. So one big Spanish fleet comes to the area in 1536 to try to kind of ward off the Portuguese explorations. The Spanish started to demand food and labor from local natives and provoke the natives to rebel against. So it's a very similar story. The Spanish greed kind of provokes a native reaction in the area. So Spanish attempts at colonizing a lot of the kind of eastern coastline fail because of that. And the Spanish fleet, for the most part, abandons the area and sails back to Spain. But one small contingent of that fleet went a little further inland and will found a city called Asuncion, which today is the capital of Paraguay. And then from there we'll move a little bit further out. Asuncion is not in this map, but they will go a little bit further out to the coastline again and build a city that they call Buenos Aires in 1541. And they don't have very good control over Buenos Aires, so there's this kind of intermittent existence of a fledgling Spanish colony at Buenos Aires for about 40 years until about the year 1580 when it's more solidified, better funded. So that's the kind of early attempts at Spanish exploration and colonization on the eastern coastline of South America, much further south than the Portuguese were laying claim to in the green highlighted areas. The Spanish are not done there, though. They want to also start exploring further north and east of the Incan Empire, or the former Incan Empire. So the Spanish, even as they're trying to conquer the Incan Empire, they start exploring the northern coastline of South America, as you can see on this map. So if you look in the little map in the corner where the square is, that kind of shows you what this is magnifying. So it's the kind of northeastern corner of the South American continent. And the Spanish will launch explorations up the Orinoco River in 1530, but that exploration fails in 1530 when a bunch of different native groups kind of consolidate and get together and form like a confederation to attack the incoming Spanish and destroy that contingent and kill the Spanish leader of that exploration. But the Spanish are not done. They're going to try to continue kind of poking and prodding around that northern coastline for several years. But the next major kind of exploration in the area will actually go to the more further western side over what is today kind of northern Colombia. And one Spanish explorer named Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada organized an expedition to go down into what is today the Bogota area, where the Muisca tribe kind of inhabited. And de Quesada's expedition will start out from the coastline at Santa Marta and will travel kind of down following the river, trying to get to wherever they think there's a large civilization that might have gold or something. So this exploration started in 1536 from Santa Marta on the coastline, and started moving south. Quesada had about 500 soldiers and explorers with him when they started, but this trek, a lot of them got sick during the voyage, and only 170 of them survived by the time they arrived at the Muisca kind of stronghold near today's Bogota. So the Muisca will try to fight off the Spanish incursion, but the problem is that the Muisca are still fighting with basically very ancient wood and stone weapons. So the Spanish, even though they're depleted, they only have 170 soldiers or so, they still rout and destroy the Muisca army. Even though the Muisca had started the battle by a sneak attack. So the Spanish, through the use of their kind of superior weaponry and armor and defenses and whatnot, are still able to control and conquer large kind of native kingdoms in the interior. So the Spanish take all the Muisca leaders captive and torture them until trying to force the Muisca leadership to tell them where there's any kind of gold deposits or any gold mines or anything like that. And the only thing that the Muisca leaders can even think of to say to stop the torture is to tell the Spanish where their own family tombs were that have some kind of gold trinkets or something inside them. So the Spanish again show themselves to be extraordinarily brutal in these conquests, and these conquests are all directed at greed. They're all just trying to enrich themselves as fast as possible. So the Spanish conquest of the Muisca around Bogota ends in about 1538 when the last of the Muisca leaders was killed. And the gold haul was more than the Cortez's conquest of the Aztec Empire, but far, far less than what Pizarro and the Spanish had found in the Incan Empire. So the Incan conquest will always be the height of the Spanish ability to steal gold out of any native kingdom. So that would be the last major group, the Muisca, that the Spanish will colonize and then conquer in all of South America. The very last step is for the last kind of Spanish governor over the conquered Incan territory to launch an invasion against the very last kind of Incan remnants that had gone into the interior to try to survive. They launched those attacks in 1572 and destroy that last Incan kingdom and bring the very last Incan emperor, the very last holdover, back to Cusco and publicly execute him in 1572. So all these conquests in South America have basically taken a little over 40 years. Pizarro really arrived in that area around the year 1530. And this last map I'm going to show you is really what we're looking at for the Spanish Empire, the Spanish dominions in the Americas by about the 1570s, around 1580, when their economics will start to change and they will start to kind of build longer-term colonial governments and colonial societies. So the Spanish Empire in the Americas is really everything here in this kind of bluish, purplish color starting off with the Caribbean islands, the first areas that were conquered after Colon had arrived. And then the other Caribbean islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and then expanding, trying to set up colonies in Panama. And then Cortez's leading the big invasion of the Aztec Empire in present-day Mexico, and spreading out from there south into what we today call Central America, and also spreading further north from what is today Mexico City. And then what we talked about today with Pizarro leading Spanish invasions of the Incan Empire along the coastline of western South America. And from there, after all the infighting, the future Spanish conquistadors will push further south all the way down to Santiago, and then further east to get to the eastern coastline at Buenos Aires. And the very last attempts at kind of exploration and conquest are along the northern coastline of South America, what is today Colombia and Venezuela. So by the 1570s, 1580s, the Spanish have brought a big portion of this under their direct control. They don't control every acre of land that's out there, but they are going to start building colonial governments for the long term to extend that control as far as possible. So tomorrow we'll talk about the Portuguese exploration and conquest and taking control over the colony of Brazil. And that'll fill in the very last piece before we go on to the first exam